everybody, and welcome back to another episode of RoboReplay, where today we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of matches all around the world that happened in Week 2. And we're going to be starting off with the event that I was physically at in Week 2, which was the Waterbury event in New England. So, for this match, the finals 2 of Waterbury District event, I really just wanted to point out one specific interaction that I really liked, as this match ended up just being kind of a curb stomp, as 230's intake was not able to fully grasp the coral in a way that 1991 wasn't able to defend, so they ended up just knocking their coral out, and since 230 was the only L4 scorer on their alliance, and the robot on the other side, 4572, ended up getting beached on algae at one point, this match kind of didn't end up being close. But one thing I really liked about how they played defense here was if we keep watching 1991 on this corner over here, we'll see them eventually get kind of beat here, where 230 is going to come back onto the other side, and 1991 is going to do this really cool thing where they're actually able to beat 230, and even though they're a little bit slower, they're able to push 230 out of their own coral station. And the reason this happens is, as we see here, is that 1991 sticks their bumper corner out like this, right? And so 230, since their bumpers are pretty wide, they're actually getting stopped by their bumpers getting caught on this little corner over here. And because of that, they're not able to get flagged against the coral station. And so 1991, even though they're not fully stopping 230 from entering in, right, they could rotate a little bit and maybe their intake would work. But 1991, just by being on this alliance wall and being able to match 230 on whichever coral station they're going to, is able to stick their little bumper corner out here and is able to stop 230 from collecting entirely. Which the only reason that's able to work is because 230 has pretty big bumpers, right? So if you do some pre-match scouting and you figure out that your opposing alliance's best robot has some pretty fat bumpers, then this could be something that you do, where you have your defense robot sent over and just target one robot, where you just have them slide across the alliance wall, right? Nothing fancy. This isn't that hard to do. You just move left and right, and you're not really rotating either. But if your opposing alliance has really big bumpers, then what will end up happening is that they won't be able to get in just if you put this little corner out, which doesn't require that much speed to be able to get inside of that. So as we'll see here, 230 ends up getting blocked, and they back up. And then at this point in the match, it's been 116, and they haven't even been able to get like one teleop score of L4 coral, maybe one at most. And so they end up deciding to just go do algae so that they're not having to deal with the 1991 team. And if we skip to the end of this match here, this ends up being a pretty big gap of score, right? We end up seeing a 127 to 95 win, 74-7, one of the highest EPA robots in the world, and 176, one of the most dominant teams in New England for the past 3 years, end up winning this event pretty easily due to some pretty good strategy offensively, as well as some really good scouting that led them to completely shut down the only threat on the Blue Alliance that could really match them, which was the power of 230, another premier team in Connecticut. Now, let's move on to the next match that we're going to take a look at in Week 2, which is the Ventura County Finals. Alright, so now we're moving on to the Ventura County Regional Final 1, where teams 4414 and 4481, High Tide and Rembrandt, will end up winning this against 971 and 4079. And those are the Alliance captains here. And what I really want to notice is what Alliance 1 does when they see that 589 comes over to play some defense. And let's just jump right into it. So first off, we can see that High Tide is immediately grabbing an algae, right? And 589 actually does some pretty decent defense here, right? Although they do get called for a foul, for High Tide actually doing a great job here baiting this foul. And let's go back and look at this quickly. So High Tide goes up, right? And they see 589 is playing defense on them. What does that mean? That means that 589 likely doesn't have the best view of them, as they're probably going to be blocked a little bit by the reef, a little bit by the cages, right? So they can't really see where the barge zone is. So what High Tide ends up saying is, let's just jump a bit in, and you see that micro movement? That was perfect. So High Tide goes from just being a little bit squared here, right? Trying to go up to score their algae, to seeing 589s directly on them, and saying, you think you're defending us? Well, let's flip it on you, and now you're going to give us some free points. And they turn themselves so that their bumper corner here, and you look at this head ref, he's looking at it, he knows what High Tide is about to do. High Tide is about to put their bumper corner into play, where exactly there. They put their bumper corner there, and by the time 589 reacts to it, it's too late. They've already contacted 4414 inside of the bar zone, and they get a free 6 points, as well as now being able to go up. Because it's just so hard to react in that quickly of a moment, and High Tide's driver just clearly has so much experience and is able to bait that foul out. So we see High Tide doing the same thing that 1619 actually was doing from last week, where they're splitting up the field, right? We're going to do Algae first when we see defense, right? Because we have our little core robot here. We have Rembrandt's doing core robot here. And we're just going to have it split up essentially like this, where Rembrandt's going to get a side, and then 5805 are going to get a side. Okay, so let's see how this plays out. And we're going to see actually 971 is also doing the same thing. High Tide don't end up scoring that, but it's okay. Now we can see that this is some great transitioning here, where in this Alliance 1, because both Rembrandts and High Tide have the capability of scoring Algae in the barge, they don't need to have that designated role of an Algae bot. And we can see that they clearly want to de-algify the reef before they start scoring some L4s. So what they do is they say, High Tide, you're going to do an Algae, while Rembrandts does L4 Coral. And then when you finish doing your Algae, Rembrandts is going to switch over to the Algae, and then you're going to do the Coral of High Tide. And the reason that they do this is so that there's never any confliction, as we can see on the right Coral station here. Down 589 is playing some defense, leaving this entire left area open for 4414 or Rembrandts, whoever is not scoring the Algae at the time, to just completely take over and just start dumping some Coral on the reef. So let's play it, and we'll see exactly as Rembrandts goes up, we see Rembrandts moves back, right, and 589 goes forward, and at the same time, we see High Tide going forward, and we switch the role again. It's beautiful. They're perfectly staggering their cycles so that in any given moment, there's never more than 2 robots inside of this zone or 2 robots inside of this zone, giving us that perfect swap, and 589's defense is much, much, much harder to achieve when 2 robots are actively switching that Algae role, which is something I think you might see from really high capability robots who have an alliance where 2 of their best scoring robots can do both of them at the same time. Right, and then we see 589 do some pretty good defense here, right? They are pushing Rembrandts out a bit, and they're not getting fouls, except for that one bait that High Tide ended up getting them. So they're playing relatively clean, and at this point, we can actually see that Alliance 7 is up on Alliance 1, even though Alliance 7 should have, theoretically, the 2 worst scoring robots by a large margin, because of the fact that 589 is forcing the Alliance 1 to keep swapping on Algae and not optimize their Coral scoring because of their presence. The Alliance 7 is able to score some free L4s, and they're able to fill up almost all of that L4 on the reef. But as we'll see here quickly, 589 goes over and is waiting for Rembrandts, and boom, as soon as they see 589 waiting, we're going to pick up that Algae. High Tide, you're going to be the Coral scoring robot now. And this switch up is just so perfect. And we can see High Tide already prepping, right? They're going to go for that Algae, and incredible work here. Let's go back. Let's look at that, how High Tide baited that foul. Right, so we see High Tide already prepping here to go for that next Algae after Rembrandts goes up for this Algae. And they can see that 589 is ready to come play defense on them, as they're already in the Algae zone to play defense. They're not going to chase Rembrandts down because there's not really any space for them to do that. It's also open field defense. It's really, really hard to do. So High Tide knows this, and they see 589 coming. As soon as they see them coming, the distance between this is not big enough for 2 robots if High Tide tries to get a foul here. And if we look at the bottom of our screen here, let's look at where High Tide does. Immediately jumps over to try to bait that foul, gets the foul, and 589 pulls off, and they're able to go to Algae zone for free. Rembrandts is able to go into their Coral scoring zone again for free, and they're able to put yet another Algae up. It is so perfectly designed, and this is what you see from the highest level of play, is this perfect switch off that goes on here. And we can see High Tide again takes another Algae, and this time Rembrandts are actually getting a little bit tripped up. So 589 does end up coming to Rembrandts, plays some pretty decent defense, right? Knocks out a Coral, knocks out a second one. But at that point, Rembrandts is already out. You can't really do anything, so they move back over, try to hit some two Algae away, right? So this is something I think we're going to see a lot of in defense, where when there's ground intakes, is what 589 is doing against this ground intake alliance is that they're knocking these algae out of the way and hitting all the coral that's getting dumped on the floor onto the side wall, so that instead of having to defend coral that's here, right, that's virtually undefendable. Instead of doing that, they're trying to make it so that they have one line over here that they have to defend, and they can position themselves in a way that they can try to play open field defense against it, instead of having to play something that's virtually impossible to play. Right? And so, as we'll keep going, again, we see High Tide is just continuously doing algae, as Rembrandts are just going for some coral, leaving High Tide completely undefended as they're just going for their algae. And Rembrandts is just going up, right? Like, the driving skill of both these teams is just incredible. 589, again, I think that they would be doing a great job in defense if 5809 was a threat on this alliance, right? If they were one of the main threats on this alliance, then I would say 589 is doing a great job, as 5805 is constantly being pressured. However, given the context of this alliance, defending 5805 is not a priority in the slightest, and I would like it a lot more if they, instead of just going to 5809 just for the sake of, pushing a robot around while you got nothing to do, I'd rather have them just wait for Rembrandts and try to just match them whichever side they go. Right, Rembrandts go this way, we're going to go this way. And just play man defense that way, then just taking some time away and playing some defense on 5805 while Rembrandts is scoring. Because what ends up happening is they end up over here while Rembrandts is here, and Rembrandts is able to get in for free, as we see again here, because 589 is taking that time to play some defense on 5805, which isn't the best choice to play defense on. And then again, we see they're doing some pretty decent job, right? Knocking them back, turning them a bit, and perfect pull off here. I mean, look at 589 here. Great job playing some defense on them while they're still in the open field. And as soon as they get in the reef, immediately pulling off so that they do not get the foul on them. And it's a clean defense, moves them around a bit, saves some time. And you can see here, right? 589 starting to learn, right? We need to keep just defending Rembrandts. We cannot let them score. And they just move away from 5805 in general. And maybe they're a bit slow, but we see again the same thing that 1991 was actually doing, where we use our bumper corner to push Rembrandts out of a position where they can collect, because we're turning them to the side, and Rembrandts has to force themselves back in to be able to even get a coral collection. So then we go back, and Rembrandts is there, and now it's at this point that the match basically gets decided, because we have High Tide now on virtually just coral scoring duty, and 589 has to defend two monsters, and honestly, it's just a little bit unlucky, because 5805, just by sitting here, even though they're not doing the greatest job of scoring, just by sitting there, they're starting to knock some coral over here, right? They're knocking some coral in front of them, which ends up leading the coral to roll over to High Tide. Like, let's look at this. Undefended coral here, and 589 is just sitting here trying to defend coral from Rembrandts, as they are still a feeder robot. But I think their time would have been much better spent trying to just stop High Tide, as if you let a robot that picks up off the ground go loose, you're just going to lose. As, I mean, look at the coral over here, right? High Tide, if they are in this position, literally does not have to move, and they will be scoring that into whatever position they want. And I think their human players also figure this out, as they've been rolling the coral as well, right? So it's been bouncing a bit forward. And so the coral ended up landing here. And, I mean, let's take a look at it, right? Immediately picks up another coral. And although Rembrandts hit that coral away, what are you going to do? There's just so much coral constantly being dumped. These ground intake robots are the future of this game. They are what I think is going to end up being meta, as I'm going to start trying to think about how to defend these robots, but I mean, it's really, really hard to try to think of a way to defend this entire thing, right? Like, defending a coral station itself is okay. That is fine. Like, you can do that. Defending virtually this entire area of the field is almost impossible, right? People are going to end up with full reefs. Like, this is just too large of an area to cover, when the reef zone is also right here. And they can literally go here or here from safe zones. Like it's really, really hard to play. And we can see 589 just goes up to climb. And although Alliance 7's two scorers, 4879 and 971, have put up a very valiant effort, right? I mean, full L4 scored, almost full L3 scored, some trough, most of L2. Like, Alliance 7 isn't a slouch, but I mean, what can you do? Alliance 1 was just perfectly swapping, perfect efficiency in that match. I mean, against the defense, they were constantly swapping who's scoring the algae, who's scoring the coral, instantly swapping, right? Perfect communication. What are you going to do? 589 played a wonderful match. Hats off to Alliance 7 for even coming this close against Alliance 1. But, I mean, this was just some perfect Reefscape play. And honestly, I can't find any flaws with it, except for the fact that Rembrandt's was a coral station robot. And once they get a ground intake, I would be terrified of them going into Worlds. Because it just seems so hard to play again. Next up, let's go check out another absolute demon, 2056 and Team Dave. Now we're going to be going over to the Ontario District's Niagara College event, where we saw teams like 2056, 1114, and 3683, all very, very high EPA robots, playing in an incredible playoff bracket. And what I want to point out here is not the fact that 2056 almost has a 5-piece auto, which is disgusting. But I do want to take a look at what the Blue Alliance decides 7757 should do as a solution to this ground intake problem that they seem to having. As if you let 2056 and 3683 just roam free, they're just going to put up more points than you because they're just that good with their ground intake. So let's take a look at what the Blue Alliance tries to do to counter this. And so first thing I want to notice is that 7767 immediately off rip takes off all 3 lollipops, right? 2 of them were already taken down by 2056 because they had used those in their auto, but the last algae that's left standing, they're immediately knocking over as it causes more turbulence in driving because there's more game pieces that are being flung around on the field, which just makes it harder for red robots to try to score. And then immediately what they do is they shove these 3 coral actually, all the way to the sides, right? We're going to see them pushing them, and they're going to roll a bunch. And something to note with these game pieces is that you don't have to give a lot of force for these guys to roll because they're just PVC pipes on carpet, right? If you give them a little bit of force, they'll just keep rolling until someone stops and tries to pick them up. So if we take a look at these coral pieces, just by hitting them a little bit, they're essentially under here. And that's just, that's way too far for a cycle. If you want to do it, essentially at that point, you'd rather just go to a coral station. And let's keep looking at what 7757 does, right? They keep saying, okay, we're going to hit the coral as long as it's not near you. And that's what they do, right? You see these 2 coral pieces? They're going to try to hit them, but it fails because they're kind of scared of 2056 doing what High Tide did, where they put their robot here, and 7557 is baited into a penalty. So instead of that, they hit any coral that they see coming towards them over, and they don't go anywhere near where 2056's bumpers could potentially get in contact with them and could cause a foul. And this works out pretty well, actually. So every time, let's take a look at 2056 human player, right? Immediately, it's just getting bumped out and all the way over, right? Look at this. Every time, they're just hitting the coral to the sides. When you hit the coral to the sides, it is not impossible to score, right? Because defense can only take you so far. But it does make it a lot harder for 2056 and makes their cycles a lot longer than the alternative, which is the coral essentially being here at all times, and you get virtually instant cycles on the reef. And we'll see this, right? They have this algae on the ground that we noticed from the lollipop that they knocked over is still there, and it'll come into play, right? Look at this. The algae hits that algae and bounces off, or rather the coral hits the algae and bounces off. And we can see every time a coral comes, they're hitting it back towards the coral station, as if it's on the coral station. Then at that point, you can essentially use the same concept of defense of we're going to put ourselves here and just try to block off anything that's right in front of us, right? And we'll continue seeing this happen, right? 2056 looking for a piece, and here comes the main issue of this type of defense is that there are 2 coral stations. If both teams have ground intakes, this alliance can just start shooting them as well, And at that point, you can only defend one coral station from all the coral being dumped onto the field, and you can't really stop both of them at the same time. And as we can see here, it looks like one of the human players is actually just on both ends, right? So we see that Team Dave's human player is on here as well as here, as they only choose to have one operator, or one driver rather. And the same is true for 2056, who only has one driver and one coach, so they have their human players in two different areas. And this allows them to flood coral a lot more efficiently, which leads them to have coral that are in much more optimal places, for example, right here. As a defense robot, it's much harder to try to block two coral from coming out at once rather than just one. So we can see, right, 2056, after they score this, I mean, 7757 does a great job blocking this half of the field off, but there's another coral station to defend. And if 7757 comes over here, then 2056 is just going to go take a longer cycle, which I think might end up having to be taken, as if you just stay here and say, oh, we locked down one coral station, it's essentially the same thing as if you're playing defense against funnel robots, and you're saying, oh, well, I sat here the whole match, so we locked down one coral station, so we did our job. But if the other alliance figures out how to cycle through only one coral station, your job's kind of useless at that point. So I think that something that we might see work a little bit better against this flooding the field is using the 7757 strategy of let's hit the coral towards the sides, and then also ping-ponging with that as well, right? So you can see 7757, again, blocks another coral, but on the other side, we have a coral right here waiting for 2056 to score it, right? And, I mean, there's also coral directly in front of them. It's just, right, they're doing a great job here, but it's just so hard to defend against this ground intake when the human players have so much power to just bounce it all the way, basically, to the reef on both sides. And so you can see, again, this coral here, untouched, and 2056 just picks it up, right? And even though we have so much coral on this side that's getting unscored and untouched, it's just so hard to play. Right, and 7757 does a great job defending this entire stash here. And I think that once we see the highest level of play happening, where we have alliances like 2056 and Team Dave on the same side as 4414 and 4481, the Rembrandts and High Tide, then we'll start to see where this type of defense actually matters, where this number of coral being blocked off actually does stop the score and does matter. But at the moment, it doesn't really matter because the gap in coral scoring ability is just too high. And so even though this defense is great and would be really, really wonderful for when you're up against like the highest levels of competition, it doesn't really work here because your alliance partners aren't able to keep up with the crazy powerhouse that they're doing. So it's kind of like until your alliance partners are virtually on the same level as the other alliance that you're trying to defend, even though your defense could be good, it really doesn't matter all that much because there's another coral station. And the value that you're getting of blocking off all of this coral doesn't apply because they don't need that coral yet. Or your alliance isn't in a place where that coral will matter, score-wise. But, as for example here, right, when I was talking about getting coral on the reef, I mean, look at 2056 here. They just go to coral on the reef and they're immediately just picking one up and they're back. Right? Look at this. Look at that coral bounce. Look at this bounce, right? Like that thing was gonna end up here or something if 7757 did not block that. The PVC pipes can go so far, and it works both ways, right? And the 7757, to their credit, does a great job here, right? Like if 2056 and 3683 were faster and faster, and their alliance partners were doing the same thing on the other side, then this dash of coral would have mattered. Like, this entire blockage was really, really good by them. However, since it never came into play because they just didn't have the output for that to matter, their defense was, although good for slowing them down a bit, it wasn't really a solution to their scoring power that the Alliance 2 needed, and what ends up happening is just that they just get gapped by like 45 points, or 35 points rather, which, I mean, you can see the difference in Coral, right? Like, that is a 27-point difference in Coral, and that is after L4s have been scored, right? So that's not even 5 points of coral, where it's like, oh, it's only like 6 cycles, 5 cycles. No, that is like 7, 8, 9 cycles that were just missed because of how incredibly good picking up off the ground is. All right, now let's move on to our final match that I want to analyze, which was a treat to watch coming into this event in week 2. I was extremely excited to watch it. It's 118 and the Roboteers versus Highlanders in 8044. So let's jump right into it. And immediately we see ground intakes again being really, really prevalent, right? On both sides. We can see that this human player station is throwing them out. We can see this human player station is throwing them out. This is essentially just going to come down to who's better at ground cycling and who could play better defense. And we can see immediately, let's look at 7483 over here, immediately locking down every single lollipop. And since those algae are starting to roll around, it's going to cause a lot of trouble for the Blue Alliance later on. And we can see, right, 7757's defense is already showing how incredibly good it is. As, I mean, you'll look at this and look at where the coral's positioned, right? This isn't herded nearly as well as 7757's is. And even though they're doing a great job, right, just moving around, it's this coral, I mean, it's bouncing basically to the reef, right? This is essentially on the reef. And Highlanders do have like somewhat of a problem, right, going up against it. It might have been their own robot issues, but the coral's there, right there for them to score. And on the other side of the field, if you look at 7917, it looks like they're trying to do a classic version of defense of that we saw from funnel robots, which doesn't really work anymore against this ground intake idea because it's just too impressive, right? It's just too oppressive. And I mean, now they're starting to realize, right? Look at 7917, right? They're starting to hit the coral out of the way, but there's again just so much coral on the right side of the field that it really doesn't matter. And again, another thing I want to point out, just to show you how incredible this coral strategy is, there's a wall here, there's a wall here, there's a big giant piece of truss here. If you are on the Blue Alliance and there's a coral here, or here, or here, you cannot see that coral from your driver station because your sight line is going to be here to your robot. This entire thing is a blank space that you cannot see if you do not have full camera vision 360 degrees around your robot, which means that all of the pieces that will end up here will essentially be untouched by defense because they don't even know they exist unless they have cameras on the robot. So if you're looking for a defense robot against some ground intakes, I check out if they have their camera systems running while they're driving in teleop, because that seems like it could be really, really big, as otherwise we might see some human players start throwing coral from this side area, bounce it towards the middle. As if you can't see there, then how are you going to defend something you can't see? Right, so checking cameras in teleop for defense might be really, really big for any defense robots that you want to scout if you have to play against a ground intake team. And again, we see, like, right, they're doing a great job pushing off some good coral, but, like, does it really matter when 118 and 2481 are just doing a great job managing the space on the right side, right? Like, 7917 is essentially doing the thing with funnel robots that I was talking about before, right? You sit in front of a coral station, you're like, I blocked a coral station off. I did my job. But then they're able to still score freely. So are you really playing defense at that point that's that effective? And I don't know. I think the answer to that might be that yes, it will end up as effective later on once you start actually getting rid of all the coral on one side of the field and you're actually like using it all up. But until then, I don't see this strategy as effective. And we can see 7483 doing the exact same thing. And the reason 7483 is doing this is, I mean, look at it on the other side, right? This coral all happened to go towards here, right? Randomly. What are they going to do? They can't see any of this. This is all a blank space to them if they don't have cameras, right? And so they end up hitting some of it just on luck, out of their way of just going to go hit 8044. But it's still there, and Highlanders can see it, but they also have some coral on their reef. And I mean, I think 7757 did what I could tell as the best job against this ground intake strategy that just started to come up. as on defense, but honestly, I feel like we might end up seeing something more high tide-esque for meta future on if we see some like really, really, really good robots, where we'll end up with teams who are just saying, okay, third robot, you're just going to be on algae duty. De-algify for us, go start stealing some algae maybe, and then, because we don't think defense is that worth it when you have ground intake, because they can't even score all of the coral that's coming out. So even if you did block off one entire coral station, it doesn't really matter. So instead, we're just going to say, go score some algae. Similar to what 1619 did in their week 1 event, which we broke down earlier, where they had an algae bot on one side of the field that was purely on algae. That was another episode of RoboReplay. If you enjoyed the breakdowns, please like. Some engagement would be lovely for the channel. Otherwise, please let me know of some videos that you want me to check out, right? Matches that you think were interesting this week. I am going to be away and not able to make videos for the next 3 days, but when I come back, I would love to have some matches that I want to check out and matches that I want to break down. So please leave them in the comments below and let me know what you're interested in. Thank you, and have a lovely day.